So here's the deal. You're never actually going to be done testing your candles. And I know that's not what you want to hear, but stick with me because I do have some good news. And that's that testing does get so much easier. And today I'm going to help you figure out if you're ready to stop obsessing over the testing process and start selling your candles. Welcome back to episode 32 of the Candle Business Podcast. I'm your host, Erica Marie Morris, and if you are new here, I have my own candle business called Memory Box Candle Co. that I run with my husband. We also have a wonderful little boy who just recently turned 18 months old. Actually, he's almost 19 months old now because time just flies by. And on this podcast, I like to talk all things starting a candle business, the whole candle business journey, and just sharing what I've learned over the past almost 5 years in business. And today's topic, I really want to jump into helping you decide if you are ready to stop testing and start selling. I know that this point right here can feel like a limbo state, and it feels like you may be stuck in it forever because let me guess, you feel like you've been testing for literally ever. It feels like it's never going to end. You've tested probably every wick series that there is, different wax combinations, maybe you've tried different jars, and you're trying to get the hang of this whole testing process, and it becomes really difficult to tell what is a good enough candle. Because maybe you've made a little bit of headway, maybe the candles that you've been making recently are doing a little bit better than your first initial candles that you got started with, but then you start second guessing yourself. The moment you think, oh, maybe that I can actually start selling these, maybe I'd be able to sell these, you start second guessing yourself and you start thinking, but is this candle actually good enough to sell? Is it going to be perfect? And let me just tell you right now that your candles will never be perfect. You will never be able to create a flawlessly perfect candle. So I want that to basically just go out of your mind because that is something that a lot of us get stuck in, is that perfection. So I don't want you to get stuck in thinking that you have to create this perfect candle. And I know that this whole process can be really overwhelming. So I've broken this episode up into 3 different pillars, essentially. So in terms of trying to figure out if your candles are ready to sell, we're going to break it up into 3 different points. So we're going to look at the safety aspect, the performance aspect of the candle, and the visual appeal. If you're thinking about starting a candle business, whether you're in the testing phase or you're preparing to launch, I have something that's going to make your life so much easier. It's my candle business launch checklist. This checklist will walk you through everything that you need to be thinking about and getting done before you launch your business so that you can feel confident and prepared. And the best part is that when you do download it, you're going to get my weekly emails that's packed with tips and advice and encouragement to help you along your candle business journey. So you can head to ericamariemorris.com/checklist to download yours right now. So let's break down the pillar that I know that probably all of you are the most worried about, and that has to do with the safety component of your candles. Obviously, we all want to make sure that we are selling a safe candle. So the big question is, how do you know if your candle is safe? So from what I've gathered over these years, it really is a combination between the ASTM, which stands for the American Society for Testing and Materials. They have a fire safety guide, which goes over everything that you need to be thinking about when you are testing your candles, and a mixture of that with some veteran candle making knowledge. The ASTM safety guidelines are really the minimum safety requirements for your candle testing. And to be honest, it's kind of common sense, so we'll make sure to go over that first. So in regards to the actual testing process, how you set up your candle testing, they recommend that you trim the wicks down if needed. They don't specify a wick length, but it's kind of known in the candle world to keep it about at 1/4 inch before you do your burn tests. And to make sure that every session of your burn, so basically for how long the candle is actually lit, for that to be in 4-hour increments. And then if you're testing multiple candles at once, which I know a lot of us do, you want to make sure that you space those candles about 8 inches apart so that the heat from the candles aren't affecting the performance of one another. Now, during the actual burn test, what you're looking for, and again, this is according to the ASTM guidelines, is they state that the flame itself should not exceed 3 inches. In my opinion, that's a really tall flame, but that is their guidelines to have it not exceed 3 inches. They also state that the jar should not break or crack while it's burning. It should not burn the surface that it's sitting on, and it shouldn't tip over while it's burning. They also added in an update in the most recent version stating that the wicks, if you are using either a single wick or a double wick, that if you're using a single wick, it should not migrate. So the wick should not move and touch the edge of the jar. And then if you're using double wicks, it should not form together to create one gigantic flame. So now let's go over the more subjective components of the actual burn testing. And I know this can be a bit confusing. There's a lot of voices saying different things. So I'm going to try to bring as much clarity to this as I possibly can. And the first topic has to do with the jar temperature. So again, there is kind of a somewhat wide range that people say to stay under when it comes to the outside temperature of your jar. So in order to test this, you have to make sure that you do have a laser thermometer or a contactless thermometer, and you want to make sure that you stay under at least 175. 175 seems to be the higher end of what people say. On the lower end, people say to stay under 140. I'm typically in the range of like 160, 165, but again, this is another reason why you have to be very intentional about the supplies that you are using. You want to make sure that you are using glass that is suitable for candle making. So you want to make sure that you are using thicker glass, not just some random wine glass that you found and you're making candles out of. You want to make sure that the vessel that you are using is intended for candle making. Another area of concern, and I've talked about this many times on my channel, has to do with the ratio of fragrance oil to wax. A lot of people use formulas that actually give them a higher fragrance oil percentage than what they are intending. And depending on the wax that you're using, if you're not measuring correctly or you're using way too high of a fragrance oil percentage than what your wax can hold, it can cause safety issues. So it can cause the fragrance oil to actually seep up out on the top of the candle. So you have essentially just little bits, little droplets of fragrance oil on top. And if you have an open flame right there, then you can kind of imagine what would happen. It would catch fire, and that's obviously not what we're wanting. So that is a really big safety concern. Another safety component to be looking out for has to do with the melt pool. So another rule of thumb is that first initial burn, it should take all of those 4 hours before it reaches full melt. And then halfway through the jar, it should take about 2 hours before it reaches full melt. Now, full melt is essentially that top melted portion where it touches the sides of the container. And in my opinion, I actually think it's okay during that first initial burn if it doesn't get to a complete full melt in that first burn. If there's a little bit of hang up on the sides, that's okay. I don't think that it has to be 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch deep in that first melt. In that first burn cycle, I actually think that it's better if it doesn't, because that helps it not to be so hot as it burns lower in the jar. Because even if you do have a little bit of hang up left over on the sides, it's going to catch up in that second or third burn. And then just make sure that you are trimming your wicks to about 1/4 of an inch in between those 4-hour burn sessions. And the last part of the safety pillar that you need to be looking out for during your burn test has to do with the way that the flame or the flames are behaving. So this is a big one because I used to think that any kind of flickering was an automatic fail. I used to think that, oh, my candle has to burn completely steady the entire duration of the candle's life. And that's not true at all. So this is all my opinion with my personal experience, but here is the difference between flames that would be an automatic fail and flames that wouldn't be. So what would be an automatic fail? An automatic fail obviously would be if the flame was taller than 3 inches, but it also has to do with the way that the flame is behaving. So if there are no drafts in the room and your flame is dancing really aggressively, there's probably an overwicking issue. If there's a lot of soot and or smoke coming from the wick, that is going to be an automatic fail, and you're going to want to choose a smaller wick or a different wick series if you have already gone through all of the sizes of that wick series. Now, there is a huge difference between a candle that is dancing aggressively and dancing calmly. Is it breakdancing? Or is it ballroom dancing? There is a huge difference. If the candle has a steady, calm movement to it, or if you open up the room and there's a quick little, if it moves and there's that quick little soot that comes off of it, it's like a little like soot kiss off of it, if you know what I'm talking about, that's okay. It doesn't mean that just because there was a teeny tiny bit of soot that came off of it, that it's an automatic fail. I've had that plenty of times with my candles. It's not a huge deal. The really big deal is that when your candle's burning so hot that it's creating this really big mushroom, this really big flame, and a lot of soot coming off your candles. I've experienced before in the past during my own burn tests, way back before I even launched my candle business, when I was trying to single wick my candle jars that have a 3.25 inch diameter, and I could not for the life of me figure out how to wick that with a single wick, because every time I wicked up enough for it to get a full melt, it just had this crazy flame, and there was even one time that it was just a crazy stream of smoke going into the air. So now let's go over the performance component of creating a good performing candle, because of course this is a huge component because we want to make sure that our candles are actually good candles. So a big part of this has to do with the hot throw. So cold throw, yes, and hot throw, definitely. So the difference between hot throw and cold throw is that a cold throw is how the candle smells when it's not lit. So you take off the lid, or if it doesn't have a lid, you're able to just smell it and be able to smell it without trying really hard. So if you're trying to basically cover your face, smell it, and you can barely smell it, the cold throw may be weak, but if you can hold it up to your nose and be able to smell it pretty strong, then more than likely it has a really good cold throw. And then in terms of hot throw, this is something that, again, kind of subjective, but there are ways that the more that you test, the more you realize what a good hot throw performance is. And that is when you are testing the candle and you come back to it an hour, hour and a half, whatever it is. Usually at that point, it should be burning hot enough to where you can actually smell that fragrance oil into the air. Because if you light it and check on it 10 minutes, it's probably not going to have a very strong throw, because the majority of that throw comes from that melt pool. So the temperature of the melt pool and everything, all the science within that, with the wick, the flames, the melt pool, the fragrance oil molecules all in there, that is what's going to disperse the fragrance into the air. So you do have to give it at least an hour or so to actually be able to smell it. So typically what I do is I do burn tests all the time in my bathroom, and I know right away if a fragrance oil is strong or not. And it has to do with, is it kind of lingering down the hallway? Is the fragrance oil coming out of the room into the hallway, into the living room? I've had that happen before, and that tells me that it has a very strong hot throw, versus if I walk in there and I'm kind of like, where's the fragrance? I'm kind of looking around. Sometimes it bounces off the other side of the wall. It's kind of weird. I can smell it almost on the other side of the bathroom, but nowhere near where the candle is and nowhere near outside the hallway. It's kind of strange. But I'll sometimes have to hover over the scent. That's a big one. If you have to hover over the candle to smell it, then it probably has a weak hot throw. But again, give it at least an hour, hour and a half for it to develop a decent melt pool so that you can give it honest feedback and kind of that honest test to see how the hot throw really is. And then make sure during this testing process that you're only testing with one fragrance oil. You don't want to be using different fragrance oils for the burn test when you're already using different materials. So let's say you're testing 5 different wick sizes and you're using a few different fragrance oils for that. You're not going to get an accurate result because you want to keep every single variable the same except for changing one thing. And in most instances, it's going to be that wick size that you're trying to test. So just make sure that you're only using one fragrance oil and you're using the exact same fragrance oil percentage for every single test candle that you're making. And then along with the performance component, so if we don't look at the fragrance oil, we're looking at just how the candle is performing. We want to make sure that the candle is not tunneling. So tunneling means that the wick or wicks are too small for the container. And usually it has to do with the diameter of the jar. So it's really that kind of sweet spot between the diameter of the jar, the wick size, the melt point of the wax, and the fragrance oil that you're using. It's all kind of everything combined to work really well together to create this balance of a candle that is pretty steady on that first burn, takes about 4 hours to reach full melt. And then throughout the burn cycles, it doesn't burn too hot, but it still burns hot enough to where it's throwing that fragrance oil into the air. So I understand, I know exactly where you're coming from, where you're like, Erica, it's easier said than done. I totally understand. But again, we're not striving for perfection. We're striving for a candle that is overall a good performing candle and it's safe. And I do also want to talk about some visual components as well. So let's talk about the visual appeal of the candles, because if you're wanting to sell these candles, you want to make sure that everything looks professional and that it looks nice. So I know a big thing in the candle making world has to do with uneven tops, sinkholes, wet spots, all of that kind of stuff. So I do have to be honest, I have worked with a wax called Soy 10 for the beginning. I've never really worked with another kind of wax. It's been my wax since the beginning, and it is a very beginner friendly wax. There's no uneven tops. There's no sinkholes. I've never had to deal with any of that. But I know that it's something that a lot of makers do have to kind of help and fix their candle to make it look a little bit nicer. So a lot of makers will heat the top of their candles with a heat gun to kind of smooth out the top. And in terms of wet spots, this is kind of that issue where a lot of makers do try really hard to avoid those wet spots. So I've heard that people will heat up their jars to make it to where there's not that drastic change in temperature, because essentially what wet spots are is it's the shrinking of the wax. So it could be that it cooled down too fast. Actually, I've had issues before years ago where I've had a customer contact me saying that their entire candle, like the wax, fell out of the tin because it got so cold and the shrinking was so bad that it just fell out of the candle. So obviously that's few and far between, but it can happen. So that is definitely, something you don't want to happen. But when you're actually looking at the candle, you want it to look nice. So you want to make sure that your wicks are centered. You want to make sure, or if you're using 2 wicks, that they're spaced about 1 inch apart in the candle and that they're even. And you also want to make sure that whatever surface that you're pouring on is leveled as much as you can. This is something that really irks Chris and something that I was really bad about overlooking in the beginning. I used to pour on tables that were very wonky and you could totally see the unevenness of my candles. And oh my gosh, it drove him crazy. So he is very much a proponent of, he will get his leveler out, making sure it's completely leveled. And I appreciate that attention to detail because that is definitely something that is, when you look at the candle and it's kind of like wonky, uneven, that kind of gives you just an immediate thought of that brand as, oh, maybe they don't care, or maybe they didn't put as much effort or as much attention to detail as this candle. So it's the little things like that when you go to actually sell your candles, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those little details. So yes, I know. It's kind of a blend of some really concrete guidelines and also some subjective testing that really just comes with more knowledge. So if you've ever cooked before or done any kind of skill, even riding a bike, like it's just one of those things that it's hard to pick up on. And then once you're in it, you just kind of know what to do and know what to look out for. That's really what the testing process is. And to be honest, you will probably just continue testing and maybe tweaking your formula a little bit along the way. I've changed our formula quite a bit since the beginning. I know I had mentioned before in the very beginning of my testing back in late 2019, early 2020, I was trying a single wick until I heard to actually test with 2 really small wicks, and it completely changed everything for me. And now I've done a custom wax blend and just kind of learned about the differences between how the candle is going to perform based on the actual melt point of the wax, how the wick series and the size is going to work with the diameter. And it's all just a science that's going to really have you understand more the more that you do it. And I know that if you're thinking to yourself, Erica, I've done it so many times and I'm still trying to figure out if it's good enough to sell. So I hope that kind of going over these guidelines, taking a step back, being able to look at your candle, if you've tested the same scent multiple times, the exact same formula, and you're getting similar results and it's burning really well and it hasn't hit any of those fail markers, then you may be good to go with getting started with selling your candles. I know this is an area that so many of you are stuck in, and I have tried to figure out how can I best help you? What is the best way that I can do to help you? Because again, it's so subjective. I personally have not worked with that many, waxes or wicks or supplies. So I only know what I know based on my own testing and my own materials. So based on that knowledge and those experiences that I've had, this is the information that I've gathered for you. So I really hope that this helps at least one of you out there that are in this limbo state of you're pushing off starting your candle business because you feel like your candles aren't good enough or they're not perfect enough, or you feel like, oh, they moved a little bit too much, like your flames or whatever it is. I want you to basically have the permission to sell if you feel like your candles have met kind of these basic safety requirements. And again, just more of that kind of veteran candle making advice that I have taken myself when it came to the testing process of my candles. So I really hope that this episode helped you out. If it did, please make sure to leave a comment down below if you're watching on YouTube, or send me a DM on Instagram at Memory Box Candle Co. and let me know, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Candle Business Podcast. I hope it encouraged you as you move forward in your own candle business journey. If you enjoyed today's episode, or if you've been loving the podcast, I would appreciate it so much if you could take just a few moments to give the show a rating and maybe even a written review so that it can help reach more aspiring business owners just like you. And always remember to spend every day working towards a life that your future self will be proud of.